His name is Pytheas of Massalia, an explorer from a Greek colony in what is now southern France, who lived in the late 4th century before Christ. Though his original writings have vanished, what remains are testimonies and quotes in later geographers like Polybius, Strabo, and Pliny. From those fragments we piece together a voyage of wonder, of ice and midnight sun, of strange peoples and shimmering seas, a journey that pushed the boundaries of what the ancient Greeks believed possible. Pytheas was born in Massalia, now Marseille, a flourishing Greek colony founded by Phocaeans, a people who traded across the Mediterranean and beyond. That society, in the 400s to 300s BC, was interconnected with trade routes for silver, wine, salted fish, amber, and metals. It is believed merchants in Massalia commissioned Pytheas's voyage, not simply out of curiosity, but in search of trade of tin and amber, resources known to lie somewhere in the distant north. The Greeks were familiar with tin islands, or cassiterides, and knew amber came from lands beyond the Baltic. Pytheas's voyage seems to have been intended to map those sources directly. Around 325 BC, Pytheas set sail into the Atlantic from Massalia. His route took him past Gibraltar, up the coast of Iberia, following the shores of what is now Spain and France. He stopped at the tip of Brittany, then across to Britain, landing perhaps in Cornwall at a place the Greeks called Belerion, famous for tin mining. From there he moved northward, exploring coasts, stepping ashore to observe people, climate, and the physical world. He claimed to have walked parts of Britain, not merely sailed past it. Pytheas's observations grew more unusual as he traveled. He noted that daylight grew longer as he moved north, summer days where the sun barely set. He recorded that in some places, nights were very short, almost non-existent during solstice, a phenomenon attested by later authors who cited him. He also observed sea ice or frozen water in regions near what is now the Arctic, descriptions that many of his contemporaries found unbelievable. Yet these fragments survived, showing that Pytheas was attentive, that his curiosity stretched to phenomena that for most Greeks seem mythic. Traveling further north, Pytheas claimed to reach a land known as Thule, 6 days' sail from northern Britain. Ancient sources disagree about exactly where Thule was. Suggestions range from Norway, Iceland, or islands in between. He described it as a place where seas were frozen or encumbered by drift ice, where nights in summer were very short and winter days dim. To the Greeks, this stretched the limits of their known world. To Pytheas, it was something to witness, record, and relay. He also paid attention to tides, to the moon's influence on the sea. Pytheas made one of the earliest known recordings of tides in Britain, noting that they rose and fell in ways tied to lunar phases. He used a gnomon, a stick or rod, to track shadow length at midday, to measure sun elevation, which in turn helped him estimate latitudes, especially of Massalia, of the places he visited, and maybe of Thule. These sundial-based measurements were rare for the Greeks at this time. To speak of shadows, solar elevation, and day length, and to tie these observations to geography was already scientific, already experimental. Pytheas's descriptions of native customs, people using honey in cereals and drinks, using barns, threshing, behaving differently with cold seasons, planting or hunting. These small details are preserved through later authors. They give texture to what would otherwise be just geographic legend. Yet not all of Pytheas's claims were accepted without controversy. Strabo, writing more than 2 centuries later, doubted parts of his account. He accused Pytheas of fabrications, exaggerations about the midnight sun, about frozen seas that could neither be walked upon nor sailed, about strange northern lights or the people of Thule. Ancient skepticism was real, partly because many statements seemed unbelievable to those steeped in Mediterranean norms. But modern scholars reviewing his fragments often find that many of Pytheas's reported observations, while poetic, are plausible given later knowledge of northern geography and climate. Despite lost originals, Pytheas's work had influence. References to his lessons appear in later geographic treatises, knowledge about the lengthening days toward the poles, about sea ice, about the behavior of tides. These took root. Also, his estimates of distances were surprisingly good in some cases. For example, he estimated the distance from Massalia, Marseille, to northern Britain, roughly in ancient terms, which modern reconstructions show was not far off. Though we cannot reconstruct his exact route fully, the cumulative reports that come down through Strabo and others give a shape that scholars accept. Iberian coast, Brittany, Cornwall, Britain northwards, possibly Orkney or Northern Isles, then Thule, then Baltic or Amber shorelines. What motivated Pytheas remains part commerce, part curiosity. Tin and amber were valuable trade goods. Greeks of Massalia had long bought amber via overland routes from the north. To find the sources of amber directly and to verify reports about far northern lands had both economic and intellectual appeal. Meanwhile, geography, the shape of the world, the behavior of night and day, the limits of habitable zones, held fascination for all educated Greeks. Pytheas, in a sense, was exploring both outward and inward. Outward toward the unknown edges of the seas, inward toward an understanding of Earth's dimensions and of human perception. As Pytheas journeyed, he must have faced harsh northern seas, cold waters, ice flows, long hours of daylight, strange flora and fauna, and people living far from the busy Mediterranean trade routes. The mental image of traveling through fog or encountering lands where sea and air seem bound together by floating ice is preserved in fragments. Whether or not some elements were embellished, many correspond with what later navigators observed. At one key moment, Pytheas tried to estimate the circumference of Britain. Some later authors record that he said Britain was about 4,000 miles in perimeter. Though the ancient measure stadia complicates modern conversion, Pytheas's declared number is impressive for an age without modern instruments. Even allowing for error in measurement units and route errors, it suggests Pytheas attempted quantitative geography, not just storytelling. By the time he returned to Massalia with his reports, his accounts must have sounded as though they belonged more in myth than in reality. But his observations about summer in distant lands, about bitter cold, about longer daylight and strange nights, about people who harvested barley and drank honey drinks, were persuasively detailed. These fragments slowly filtered into Greek and later Roman geographical writings. Pytheas of Massalia survived more in citation than in fame. His original work on the ocean has not survived, but its influence has endured among scholars who respected empirical observation before it was commonly honored. After months of sailing along the rugged coasts of Britain, Pytheas reached the very limits of the known world. To his Greek audience, even the idea of a land beyond Britain sounded impossible. The Greeks had long believed the Northern Ocean was impassable, a place where the sea turned to mist and monsters dwelled. Yet Pytheas insisted there was something beyond, a place called Thule. He wrote that Thule lay 6 days' voyage north of Britain, beyond the northernmost isles. He described it as a region where the nights were very short, where at the summer solstice the sun barely dipped below the horizon, a description that perfectly matches the phenomenon we now call the midnight sun. To ancient Greeks, this was astonishing. It meant that Pytheas had reached, or at least heard directly from those who lived near, the Arctic Circle. He claimed that beyond Thule, there existed a strange mixture of earth, air, water, and fire, a semi-liquid substance through which neither ship nor foot could pass. Later interpreters suggest this might refer to sea ice, slush, or even the thick Arctic fog and floating ice fields common in the North Atlantic. Though his contemporaries mock this as fantasy, modern climatologists have found his descriptions surprisingly accurate for northern waters around Norway or Iceland in summer. From these clues, historians believe Pytheas either reached the coast of Norway or perhaps even sighted Iceland. The distance of 6 days' sail north from northern Scotland fits well with sailing speeds of ancient Greek vessels, aligning closely with the Norwegian coast near Trondheim. Yet other scholars argue Thule could have been the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, or even an early report of the icy waters near Iceland, all regions that fit his description of long days and misty seas. Whatever its precise identity, Thule entered history as a symbol of the ultimate frontier, the edge of the world. The Romans would later adopt the word to mean any far northern, mysterious land. Even centuries after Pytheas's death, poets and geographers still used Ultima Thule to mean the farthest place, a tribute to the man who dared to say he had seen it. But Pytheas was not just a traveler, he was a scientist. His work combined geography, astronomy, and mathematics in ways centuries ahead of his time. Using a gnomon, a simple vertical stick, he measured the angle of the sun at noon at different latitudes. By comparing the length of shadows in Massalia and in northern regions, he could estimate how far north he had gone. These calculations, recorded secondhand by later authors like Strabo and Geminus, show a sophisticated grasp of geometry. He effectively used the Earth's curvature as a measuring tool, 2 millennia before the age of satellites. One of Pytheas's most remarkable achievements was his description of the tides. He was the first known Greek to correctly associate the tides with the phases of the moon. Ancient Mediterranean sailors knew tides existed, but only slightly. The tidal range there is small. When Pytheas traveled to Britain and beyond, he encountered powerful tides that rose and fell dramatically. He observed, measured, and concluded that these changes corresponded to the moon's orbit, a leap of reasoning centuries ahead of its time. Modern science would not fully explain tidal behavior until Isaac Newton's gravitational theory, nearly 2,000 years later. Pytheas's journey was not just through strange seas, but through new kinds of knowledge. He took note of how northern peoples lived, their agriculture, clothing, food, and customs. He described how they used barley as a staple grain and honey to make fermented drinks, likely the earliest written mention of mead in European literature. He recorded that these peoples stored their grain indoors and threshed it in covered barns, a practice unknown in the Mediterranean but essential in damp northern climates. These small details were so unusual to Greek ears that many dismissed them as fabrications. Yet archaeology now confirms such customs were indeed practiced in prehistoric northern Europe. He also wrote about amber, the golden fossil resin highly prized by Greeks and Romans alike. Pytheas traced its origin to the lands beyond the Elbe River, the first Greek to describe what we now know as the Baltic coast. He noted that the inhabitants collected amber washed up on shores and used it for trade. His route likely took him along parts of the North Sea coast and into the Baltic, perhaps even to the Jutland Peninsula or southern Scandinavia. His accounts of amber trade routes were later used by Roman merchants centuries afterward. From Pytheas's surviving fragments, it seems he understood the shape of Britain remarkably well. He recognized that it was an island, a conclusion not confirmed again until the Roman invasions more than 3 centuries later. He described its perimeter, noted the many tribes who lived there, and even mentioned islands to the north, likely the Orkneys and Shetlands. He was among the first to recognize that the islands stretched farther north than the northern coast of France, challenging Greek geographic orthodoxy that had long misrepresented Europe's shape. All this information came from a man sailing in a small, open vessel, powered by oars and sail, with primitive instruments, through some of the most treacherous seas in the world. His courage and endurance were extraordinary. No ancient Greek before him, and few after, would dare to venture so far beyond the familiar world. But when Pytheas returned home to Massalia, he found disbelief waiting for him. His account, On the Ocean, was filled with wonders that seemed impossible. The midnight sun, frozen seas, distant amber lands, and people who lived at the world's edge. To scholars of the Mediterranean, accustomed to blue skies and warm seas, such descriptions were fantastical. The great historian Polybius accused him of lying. Strabo, writing centuries later, repeated the accusation, calling Pytheas a teller of tales. Yet neither man had ever been to those lands themselves. Ironically, their skepticism preserved Pytheas's memory, for in refuting him, they quoted him. Through their criticism, lines of his lost book survived, scattered across centuries of geography and history. When Strabo scoffed at Pytheas's claim about the sun never setting, he unwittingly confirmed Pytheas's originality. Modern astronomers later proved that such a phenomenon was real north of the Arctic Circle, exactly where Pytheas claimed to have been. Even the term Thule, which Strabo mocked, became a powerful symbol in Western thought. For centuries, Ultima Thule appeared on maps as a poetic label for the unknown, sometimes placed near Norway, sometimes Iceland, sometimes even Greenland. Medieval explorers and Renaissance mapmakers used the term to mark the frontier between the known and the mysterious. In this way, Pytheas's words echoed across 2,000 years of exploration. Modern historians have painstakingly reconstructed his likely route. Based on his measurements and geographical clues, it seems Pytheas sailed from Massalia through the Strait of Gibraltar, along the coast of Spain, around Brittany, across the English Channel, and up the western coast of Britain. From there, he crossed to the Orkneys, then north to Thule, probably coastal Norway. On the return, he may have visited the Baltic coast before heading back south to Gaul. His journey covered more than 10,000 kilometers, an extraordinary feat for a man with no map of the Atlantic. The timing of his voyage was also crucial. Around 325 BC, Alexander the Great's conquest in the east had expanded Greek knowledge of Asia, but the western and northern worlds remained blank spaces. Pytheas's journey complemented the eastern discoveries of that era. While others charted India and Persia, he charted the cold northern edge. In a sense, he was Europe's counterpart to the explorers of the East, mapping the opposite horizon of Greek imagination. Pytheas's scientific approach distinguished him from mere adventurers. He was not a conqueror, nor a merchant in the usual sense. He was an observer. His combination of travel, measurement, and natural philosophy anticipated the methods of later scientists. 2,000 years later, figures like Galileo and Humboldt would echo his spirit, the belief that the world could be understood through careful observation, even in the harshest conditions. But to his contemporaries, Pytheas was a puzzle, a man whose discoveries were too advanced, too strange, and too far beyond their horizon. He died in relative obscurity, his manuscripts fading into the libraries of later scholars. Yet over time, as Roman expansion brought northern Europe into contact with the Mediterranean, piece by piece his once ridiculed descriptions proved true. The tides followed the moon. The summer sun did not set in northern lands. Amber came from the Baltic. The island of Britain was real and ringed by the sea. Slowly, the ghost of Pytheas's credibility returned. By the dawn of the Roman Empire, Pytheas's story had become both legend and foundation, an account of a lone Greek who dared to go farther than anyone before him. Even centuries later, when Claudius Ptolemy compiled his Geographia in the 2nd century AD, echoes of Pytheas's latitude, data remained hidden in the coordinates of the northern world. Pytheas's life stands as a rare example of intellectual courage. He not only traveled but measured, not only saw but reasoned. He ventured beyond myth into the realm of the verifiable. And because of that, he was misunderstood for generations. His map of the northern world was never drawn in his lifetime, yet his words helped later ages imagine it. By the time his name resurfaced in Renaissance Europe, Pytheas had already become a symbol, the archetype of the explorer-scientist, the man who went to the edge of the world not to conquer it, but to understand it. Centuries passed after Pytheas of Massalia vanished from history's stage. His city continued to trade and thrive, but his writings, preserved in fragile papyrus scrolls, began to fade from circulation. Yet the echoes of his voyage lingered like whispers in the libraries of the learned. Scholars debated whether his Thule existed or whether the Greek had simply invented it. His observations, recorded by later authors, remain scattered fragments, misunderstood, doubted, and even mocked. But time would become Pytheas's greatest ally. As the centuries unfolded, the world would slowly catch up to the truths he had discovered. When the Romans began to expand into northern Europe, they unknowingly retraced the outlines that Pytheas had first charted. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and his expeditions across the Channel to Britain confirm what Pytheas had already written 3 centuries earlier, that the island was real, surrounded by ocean, and inhabited by diverse tribes. Roman geographers, once skeptical of the Greeks' claims, now began to see their accuracy. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, mentioned Pytheas by name and referred to his accounts of the far north. Though Pliny remained cautious, he acknowledged that Pytheas had at least seen more of the northern world than any man before him. As the Roman Empire grew, its geographers and mapmakers inherited the patchwork of Greek knowledge. Some borrowed Pytheas's latitude calculations without realizing their origin. The Roman world still feared the icy seas and endless nights of the north, but curiosity persisted. Expeditions to the northern isles, the coasts of Germania, and even the Baltic were recorded, all moving along the same invisible path Pytheas had taken. Yet to the Romans, Pytheas remained an enigma, a voice from a time when the earth was smaller, but imagination was vast. Then came the collapse of Rome and the long centuries of darkness that followed. Much of classical geography vanished into oblivion. The libraries that had once held copies of On the Ocean were burned, looted, or simply forgotten. For nearly 1,000 years, Pytheas's name disappeared from the maps of men. The world turned inward, and exploration slowed to a crawl. The edges of the known world shrank once more. The age of rediscovery had not yet come, but ideas once born never truly die. During the early medieval period, the echoes of Pytheas's voyage resurfaced in the writings of scholars like Isidore of Seville and later in the Norse sagas. The Vikings sailing from Scandinavia across the North Atlantic rediscovered many of the same lands Pytheas had described. They too encountered midnight suns, icy seas, and distant islands, lands that could easily have been his fabled Thule. Without ever knowing his name, they followed in his wake, confirming the northern reality he had once dared to describe. By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Europe's hunger for knowledge was awakening again. The rediscovery of classical texts transformed the continent, and scholars began to piece together the lost works of ancient Greece. In this intellectual rebirth, fragments of Pytheas's writings resurfaced through the quotations of Strabo, Pliny, and Diodorus. Renaissance scholars, obsessed with the past, began to wonder if perhaps this forgotten Greek had truly seen the edge of the world. In the 15th and 16th centuries, when European explorers set sail westward in search of new lands, Pytheas's story gained renewed significance. Columbus, Magellan, and Cabot ventured into the Atlantic, believing they were reaching the farthest frontiers. But Pytheas had done so over 1,800 years earlier. As Renaissance cartographers drew the New World, they also revived the old word Thule. It began to appear again on maps, often placed near Iceland or Norway, a poetic symbol for the world's end. To the scholars of the age, Thule represented both mystery and courage, the eternal boundary between what is known and what lies beyond. Gerardus Mercator, the 16th century mapmaker who revolutionized navigation, even included Thule on his maps, labeling it with quiet reverence. To him and others, Pytheas had become a mythical figure, the first geographer of the Atlantic, the man who had looked into the unknown. The irony was profound. Centuries after being ridiculed, Pytheas had become a hero to the very people who redrew the world. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries finally provided the tools to confirm Pytheas's observations. Astronomers studying Earth's axial tilt realized that his reports of endless daylight perfectly described the regions above the Arctic Circle. Natural philosophers recognized his account of congealed seas as an early reference to the frozen ocean, sea ice. When physicists like Newton and Laplace explained the connection between the moon and tides, they acknowledged that Pytheas had been the first to suggest it. His intuitive grasp of natural phenomena was no longer fantasy. It was validated science. By the 19th century, as Europe embarked on a new age of exploration, Pytheas was rediscovered by historians of science. Scholars such as Humboldt, Bunbury, and Thomson re-examined his fragments and found in them the birth of empirical geography. They saw in Pytheas a man of reason, not myth, the prototype of the modern explorer who records, measures, and questions. His method of using the gnomon to determine latitude was recognized as one of the earliest practical applications of astronomy to geography. In a world where knowledge and discovery had become intertwined, Pytheas stood revealed as one of history's first true scientist explorers. Modern archaeology further vindicated him. Excavations in northern Europe uncovered ancient trade routes that matched his descriptions of amber commerce. His claim that northern peoples cultivated grain and brewed fermented drinks was proven accurate by pollen analysis in archaeological remains. Even his remarks about the Britons' agricultural customs found confirmation in Iron Age farm structures unearthed in Scotland and England. Each discovery peeled away another layer of skepticism that had shrouded his name. Today, Pytheas is often compared to figures like Herodotus or Eratosthenes, pioneers who expanded humanity's mental map. Yet, unlike them, Pytheas had no empire to fund his journey, no army at his back, and no assurance of fame. He sailed with traders, perhaps in a single small ship, driven not by conquest but by curiosity. That distinction makes him unique. He was an explorer of the intellect as much as of the sea. In modern historical atlases, Pytheas's route is often drawn as a thin, uncertain line stretching from the sun-drenched harbors of Massalia to the gray fogs of the northern Atlantic. That line, though tentative, represents one of the most daring voyages ever undertaken in the ancient world. It was a journey into scientific history, from the warm Mediterranean to the threshold of the Arctic, from myth to measurement. His story reminds us that discovery is not just about finding new lands. It is about expanding the boundaries of what we believe possible. Pytheas dared to challenge the limits of Greek geography, to measure the unmeasurable, and to describe what others refused to believe. He transformed hearsay into data, legend into observation. Even though his book is lost, his influence runs like a hidden current through centuries of science and exploration. In the 20th century, astronomers studying polar light phenomena and geographers mapping Arctic regions often quoted his name. The concept of ultima Thule was revived once again, this time not as a myth, but as a metaphor for human aspiration. The drive to go beyond the known. When NASA's New Horizons spacecraft flew past the distant Kuiper Belt object in 2019, scientists nicknamed it Ultima Thule, honoring Pytheas's ancient symbol of the ultimate frontier. Across 2.5 millennia, his vision had reached beyond Earth itself. What remains most remarkable about Pytheas is his humility before the vastness of nature. Unlike conquerors or kings, he never claimed dominion over what he found. His words reflect wonder rather than triumph, curiosity rather than control. He stood at the edge of the known world and saw not an ending, but a beginning. To him, the northern seas were not barriers. They were invitations to learn. If Pytheas could see the world today, mapped, measured, and photographed from space, he might marvel at how far that impulse to explore has carried humanity. From his fragile boat to our interplanetary probes, the thread remains the same, a desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. Every satellite orbiting Earth, every scientific expedition to the poles, every ship sailing under distant stars follows the same ancient current that first carried a Greek mariner out of Massalia. And so, when we speak of the origins of exploration, we must speak of Pytheas. He may have vanished into legend, but his ideas endured. The tides he measured still rise and fall. The sun still hangs in the sky above the lands of Thule. His was a voyage not only across the seas but across time, a journey that continues each time we push farther into the unknown. Pytheas of Massalia, the man who discovered the edge of the world, left no empire, no monument, and no grave. Yet his legacy is written across every map, in every line that reaches beyond certainty into mystery. His name stands as the quiet beginning of a story that still defines us, the story of discovery.